So welcome back. My name is Gareth Doherty. I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture at the Graduate School of Design and affiliate faculty in the Department of African and African American Studies. And I'm really happy to be moderating this panel on pedagogies. We're asking, how is landscape architecture currently taught across the African continent, and what future directions it might take? And we have three more fantastic speakers. Finzi Saidi is a Zambian landscape architect who is currently the head of the department and senior lecturer in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. He taught at the Copperbelt University in Zambia and the University of Pretoria before he served as convener of the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the University of Cape Town from 2006 to 2008. And in fact, that's where we first met, at a review at the University of Cape Town. Sechaba Maape is an architect and senior lecturer at Wits University in Johannesburg. He's director of the design practice Afriteacher. Did I get it right? Afriteacher. Dr. Maape was born in Kuruman in the Northern Cape province of South Africa. He works on research projects, teaches architecture, design, history and theory, supervises master's thesis projects, and spends a considerable amount of time visiting ritual sites all over the country, and also watching GSD lectures on YouTube, religiously on YouTube. So thank you for coming. And we first met at a focus group in Johannesburg, where Graham was also there, and Finzi. And I remember one of the memorable moments of that discussion was when you told us that your students resisted some of your teaching and said that you were teaching. If I remember this correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that your students said that you were teaching them to design cities for white people. And you said, well, show me what a city for black people is like. So I hope we can see some of that today. Carey Duncan is a South African landscape architect living in Morocco. She owns Carey Duncan Design and is lectured at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. Carey is the immediate past president of IFLA Africa, where she was instrumental in creating the African Landscape Network, the ALN, and launching the African Journal of Landscape Architecture, AJLA. I've met Carey in a number of different venues and occasions over the years, and I was struck when you told me that you had given a presentation on landscape architecture all over Africa, and so that's why Carey is contributing to this panel. So the order is Finzi, Sechaba, and Carey, and I'd like to invite Finzi to come to the podium.
Salibunani, Kunjani, Mulibwanji, habari yako, Tumelan, Ahe, Molweni, and Huyamora. It's really great to be here, and I want to thank Gary and the organizers for bringing us together. I think it was just a dream when we first met about 2 years ago when you were discussing. And to be here in person, it's really great, and be part of this historic, I think, gathering for discussing futures of landscape architecture. First, I think I would like to preface, let me introduce myself. Where do I click first? not a touch screen. On the remote. Yes, yes. So that's the title. I'm always obedient, so I just kept it as it is, Alternative Futures. But I've got my own title, which might sound like the disobedient academic. That's what I wanted to put there. But pause that for now. Before that, so I teach at the University of Johannesburg. I studied architecture because I wanted to solve the housing problem. But in architecture, they taught me about Frank Lloyd Wright, Carey, and Zaha Hadid. So when I finished my 5 years of architecture, I still didn't apply or couldn't apply the aesthetic principles of architecture to the social, cultural, and economic problems of Zambia. So after a few years of practicing, I said, I gotta study something else which I don't know about. And what is that? That's landscape. So I went for a master's in landscape architecture, studied at Newcastle upon Tyne University, and I knew more about Versailles, Villa d'Este, and all the other Frank Lloyd Wright, and tomorrow I'll walk around the necklace, the landscape there. I knew all of that by the back of my hand, then went back to Africa. And so said, where do we start from here with all this knowledge? So I taught for a bit and got frustrated. I really don't know how to teach architecture. What do? I do a PhD in understanding the curriculum of teaching architecture and landscape architecture, and that's why I'm speaking about. So it's still an experiment. It's not successful, people. It is an alternative way. As we say in landscape architecture, that there's no one solution. It is an ecological solution. That means many components. And I believe my component is one part which I bring to the debate and provoke, hope to provoke you into a critical discussion. And so I'm wearing a lovely necklace. This is from Swaziland. It's written 15X. It's 15X. 15X is a unit that we formed at the Graduate School of Architecture at Johannesburg from the unit system Africa, which was formed by my former colleague, Leslie Loco, and I worked with her. And when she said, let's form Unit System Africa, I said, yes, I'll back you. And you're going to run a unit? I said, yes. And what is that unit? It's going to be about landscape, 15X. So what is it about? X, I don't know. I don't know. So we got to find out what, and that's why our unit is named 15X. But we had a number of positions from which to come from, which is that we're going to research landscapes in Africa, in post-colonial societies, to propose culturally appropriate designs in the ever-changing context of the African continent. That's big. And in 2005, when I started the PhD, no one was talking about it. And in 2016, when we started the unit, we were about the only ones talking about the context informing the curriculum. And we began the experiment. So that's the 1886 map. And there you see at the bottom, in the green dot, that's where I am based at the moment, South Africa. And then there's Zambia there. And the other country there is Dixon's Ghana there, who was my colleague we worked with. So I come from Central Southern Africa, and that's why I speak all of these languages. because we were central and we were influenced by everyone. And that's where I come from. I was born a few kilometers from the mighty Victoria Falls, as the colonialists called it, but we call it the Mosi Otunya, the smoke that thunders. And at the bottom there is Nyamayami, the spiritual snake that lives there and guides the existence of this mighty Victoria Falls. Tabo will say Victoria Falls is in Zimbabwe. We fight about that. But I say the best part is in Zambia. I studied landscape architecture not because I knew who Peter Walker or Martha Strauss and Laurie Orrin and all of us others designers were. No. My study in landscape architecture was informed by the Copper Belt, which was where my university was. And I was informed by the fact that there was much extraction of metal and overburden, that there would be a landscape at the end that will need to be dealt with. So I went to study landscape architecture. Unfortunately, Versailles was in the subject and nothing about this. But anyway, this is to say where I'm from. So 15X project researches landscape. It is within an architecture program, master's and honors in architecture program. So it's not a landscape course per se, but because I'm a landscape architect, I force myself onto the architect's agenda as a way, one, of upsetting them, two, of informing the students that, look, architecture really is part of the landscape. And that's why we called our unit Landscapes Research Unit. So this story is of about 10 years with my colleagues. We've been researching and shaping landscape architecture. We want to give some clarity on the more multi-focused strategy for the future of landscape architecture and urbanism in Africa. We also want to provoke a robust discussion, to provoke a critical discussion. Above all, I really want to enjoy myself. I enjoy teaching. From the time I left practice, I enjoy teaching because of the transformative nature. And it's informed by a transformed class that I've been teaching through the number of years. From one class, which at one point was 122 students at Pretoria University, 120 students, 114 white students, and 6 black students. And that's about 20, 25 years ago. And when I looked at that class, as the years went by, the numbers changed. It hasn't moved much. Nowadays there will be 90 students and 20 black students. But I knew that the class was changing. And therefore, we can't have a curriculum that only speaks about Frank Gehry, Frank Lloyd Wright, Martha Strauss, and we need some color in the curriculum. And so we spoke about transformative pedagogy that will respond to the context. As the students come to the class, what do they bring? Yesterday was very clear in many of the speakers, excellent speakers, listening. So as an academic, we began to listen to what our students were telling us. Why? And not because we didn't know what we wanted to do, no. But we knew that the students were going to show us the way in future by way of setting us the challenges of trying to understand who they are, their background, and where they come from. And using that to develop an architectural landscape, urban design, and planning approach. And so we even pretended we changed our dressing. No tie. We removed the tie and put in batik and everything else. And so over the years, we started in Soweto, then we went to Kampala, we went to Dar es Salaam twice, then we went to, back in the COVID time, we were in the toxic landscapes of Gauteng, again, the mines, abandoned mines. Then we did landscapes of memory in Gauteng and Botswana, and memory on the margins in Venda last year. Design is memory. So the memory of Venda in the south there is memory of the Bantustans. What we haven't told you is that every city, or most of the post-colonial cities in Africa, if you take a drone at 6 o'clock, the cities decant. All the black people go to their homelands, the Bantustan. The city is left empty. It still happens 50 years after independence. And so Tunji talks about who owns the land and all of that. When you look at the movement, you know who owns the city. The African city is not really the city for all. It's not accessible. And those are the challenges that we designers, no matter what we do, must be able to address. And so if we raise that in the studio, I believe, with the students, then we're beginning to answer the questions of the future. And so I won't go through the projects. So we went to Kampala to understand projects on the margins of Kampala and the wetlands that Thabo is talking about, and looking at economies and spaces and public buildings, which were all we called informal, but actually the first places where all Africans arrive when they come to the city. And that's Kampala, and that's the students' project. Some of the projects were going into the cultural aspects, experiences of women in the city. How do women navigate the city with the challenges, cultural challenges of men catcalling them, but also forced marriages and all of that? Those agenda don't come out on their own. They come with the student who presents the project to us when we set the agenda, that this is what we want to talk about, and the students say, I want to focus on women, and we give them the scaffolding. We're listening to the student. Public landscapes, also in Dar es Salaam, we were looking here at spiritual landscapes of how water could be treated using understanding. We found that the spiritual snake in Nyoka ya Manzi in Sikotsa, the same concept is there in Tanzania, 6,000 miles away. How is that? So we were able to find some level of universality at an African level of understanding landscape from a spiritual sense. We looked at abandoned train stations. That's the landscape of the black people, because they had to get out of the city at 6 o'clock. And so memory, how do we memorize? We make monuments, they win awards, but nobody goes there. How do we go there? And so I'll skip through. We make memorials. Those memorials of our chiefs in Botswana, it's great, but actually, if you chop off their heads, they are monuments of the leaders from Korea, North Korea. So what memory is that? So we question that with African ways of memorializing. Sorry. But the last one that I want to speak about is this project about the Congo DRC. One student of mine came from the Congo DRC. How do we memorialize the landscape? And that timeline there, that shows you from 1940s, uranium, gold, cobalt, copper, coltan, side by side with huge violence and a damaged landscape, and the people violated by high levels of violence. And so my student, Banza, tries to create a memorial landscape with a memorial sculpture that can go all around the world to tell the story about the war in the Congo DRC, which, by the way, all of you who have cell phones must know about it. And so we set that for the student, boundaries for the students in which to do that project. The last one is a student of mine who's sitting over here. That's Miss Mochabi Lerato. Over there are the people we call traditional health practitioners, THPs. Some of them call them sangomas. But what they were doing there is that they were interrogating the projects of my students and other projects that they had done over the on African spirituality over the last 4 years, 5 years. And so we are using research to inform our research in design and see how we can understand African spirituality in the public space, in the townships of our cities. How can we bring in African spirituality? Okay. This is just a summary. Matt, is it possible for the 30 seconds to show the video for a wrap-up? And so with this approach, I think we are broadening the agenda of what to teach. But the word that I want you to go away from this talk is epistemic disobedience. That is what we are doing, because we face a huge resistance from the profession. Are you guys doing architecture, landscape, or whatever? Matt, is it possible? 30 seconds, 30 seconds. Fast forward a bit. Okay. Yes. Okay, cut. Colleagues, thank you. I'll explain what all that was about. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my presentation with you today. So today I'm going to talk about how I have been trying to connect indigenous knowledge systems from South Africa with teaching architecture. I'm an architect and I teach architecture students. And this work is based on my PhD research, which for the theoretical guys, it was grounded on what's called cultural neurophenomenology. I won't get into too much of that. But it sort of relates to the work that's being done by people like Bruno Latour and his GSD lecture also, which was quite epic. And people like Donna Haraway, Achille Mbembe in South Africa, who his recent work talks about decolonization and landscapes. So this is an image of a site in the Northern Cape province of South Africa. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because this is a pedagogical tool, an indigenous pedagogical tool. It's called Driekops Eiland, and these are engravings that actually reside at the bottom of a riverbed, meaning that when it rains, these engravings are no longer visible because obviously there's water, and when there's drought, the engravings are exposed. And so what archaeologists and anthropologists say is that when the engravings are exposed, it's an opportunity for ritual, and that's obviously connected to the cycles of the landscape. But this is also a place where teenage initiation happens for girls. The local people say it's the back of the snake that Finzi was just talking about right now, the back of the head of the snake. And so the snake in my culture and many other cultures in Southern Africa actually represents the contingent nature of the natural world, the contingency or mutability or change that exists within the natural world. And so a teenage girl comes here because she's actually being brought into a relationship with this contingent nature of the world. So she's being taught how to cope or how to understand or how to deal with contingency, because the snake will appear as pregnancy one day, the snake will appear as the death of a loved one one day. So the snake is really this cultural and spiritual entity that helps them deal with life. So this image here is another image that shows pedagogical tools from Great Zimbabwe, and they embody the same kind of things. So for instance, my wife, who's from Zambia, when a young woman is about to get married, they use a chicken as this pedagogical tool where the different parts of the body of the chicken represent certain aspects of life, and they will teach her how to basically be as a woman. And so the same thing with these tools here, which are pre-colonial. So in other words, you're looking at pre-colonial textbooks, so to speak. So okay. So this is a cave that I studied during my PhD. And this cave is really a ritual site, and it's also a place where the snake lives. And so when you're a young boy in my community and you're becoming too troublesome for your mother and your ego has become overly inflated, basically you're brought to this place to come and confront the snake. And mind you, you've been conditioned your whole life. So as I was growing up, I was shown this site from far. It's like a hill, and you know, everyone would say, the snake is there, the snake is there, the snake is there. Oh, this person did such and such thing, the snake took them. This one did such and such thing, the snake took them. And lo and behold, when you're a teenager, you have to go and visit the snake in this cave. And so the form of the cave, its darkness, its quietude, and all of that are part of the instruments of the pedagogy of teaching and learning in terms of being a socially acceptable member of society. And so there's some kind of way in which there's a way of being in the world that relates to our culture where I come from. And so in this drawing, you can see that the person is kind of sitting in almost a submissive pose in relation to the universe, or in relation to the cosmos, or in relation to the land. And so this is actually ultimately what you're being taught. It's about humility, or what we call in my culture, ubuntu, or botu. It's a way of being in the world where you don't see yourself as this adversary or this colonizer, but you see yourself as this person who is in relationality. And so as part of my research, I've been trying to articulate through, some conventional architectural methodologies how to represent some of these places. And because of this instrument of so-called fear, the way I've drawn them is to try and represent them in that way in the landscape. Somebody once said to me, oh, why does your culture use fear to, solicit certain outcomes with people? And it's just like, well, that's what they do in my culture. Yeah. And so here what this was for the Venice Biennale, I was one of the curators of the South African Pavilion, and we created kind of like a cave-like space where we were trying to draw or bring these principles into the arsenale. And these drawings represent the living landscape as this teacher. And the black space obviously represents the cave. And so as part of my teaching, what I do is I take students to these sites. They visit these places, and I kind of try and give them a sense of what this means. You know, going there is all about dealing with your sense of inflated ego and, you know, I'm such a great guy. I'm going to design on the site, you know, I'm going to intervene on the site. And that's actually what we're trying to mitigate. We're trying to get them to recognize that there's Ubuntu. You know, the video yesterday of the plastering of the building, I saw that as somebody who's showing love to the building. You know, it's not this antagonistic, I'm intervening thing. And so I take students to go and understand that. And so this is kind of like a concept sketch of my teaching method. So what you're seeing here is a group of students. They're all kind of wearing this head dress because they are they've kind of gone through a ritual process of forming values and forming a community. And now they're looking at what we call a site or land, and they're intervening. They're thinking about how to intervene on this site as an entity that also commands and demands respect. And so as part of the Biennale, one of the things that we were testing is this principle, this idea called the Council of Non-Human Beings. So imagine in a design crit, you have one of the students who's basically embodying the spirit of an animal or embodying the spirit of a particular landscape entity, and you're busy going about doing your crit, and then suddenly they walk into the studio and they start basically demanding that you answer to some of the decisions that you're making as a designer. And so this person here is kind of embodying the spirit of the elephant or the spirit of, sorry, I sound very nervous, don't I? And so the first thing that I do with the students is they basically formulate their values. They come together because we've got a diverse group of students in South Africa. And they have to come up with values of how they're going to interact with the landscape. What are they actually going to do? And those values are then encoded into this artifact. So maybe, for instance, there's a value of trust or a value of peace or a value of whatever. And that's the encoding that you're seeing in this object here. And so when they're working, they're constantly looking at that and they carry it. And that's like their, you know, that's the spirit that they're carrying in their project. And then they go through some kind of ritualization. They have to invent a ritual that helps them also mediate themselves amongst each other. So this is a kind of performative process. This object that they've created also is kind of like an embodiment of their values. It's a pedagogical tool as well. And so you can see the diversity of the class. Some people are Muslim, some people are Hindu, some people are Christian, some people have indigenous African beliefs. And now you have to get them all to interact and to deal with the site. And remember, land is contested in South Africa. And you know what our friend here wants to do with, yeah, let me not get into that. And so here you see the students going through this performance. And so this performance, this ritual is a precondition before they even start talking about what is the concept of the site, what is the concept of my building, what is the concept of my design. They actually have to go through this ritual that they invent. So just to, Gareth, to go back to what you were asking me, I don't design or make them design a non-European or whatever. They have to decide what that means for them. And they have to contest it out because some students are Afrikaans students, for instance, and they have certain values about the land. Some are indigenous, they have certain values about the land. So what you're seeing here is the outcomes of them having like fought it out, and this is like the outcome. And so now you see them actually engaging the land. So the outcomes, what this model shows is how far they were able to actually deal with those conflicts. And also, the other thing here is that some of the students represent the land itself. So, you know, some of the group will be the architects and the developers and the whatever, but some of them actually are the voice of the land. And so whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that you're going to have some sort of process of mediation. But remember, I took them to the caves and I took them to these sites where they learn about how to dissolve the ego. So you can see here that diversity of students, and they are intervening. And I'm not saying all of them get it right and all of them create something that is in harmony with the land. It's just an illustration, or it's just how far they were able to come up with the right kind of values. And so what you're seeing here is actually what we were doing on Tuesday. This is in one of our first-year studios. So on the right side, my right, these students represent the new site that we're dealing with now. So some of them represent the animals, the insects, the trees, the actual soil, the water, etc. The other ones on that side are the ones who have come up with design concepts. And so I had them basically go through some kind of a debate. They had to argue. And so what was incredibly fascinating in this exercise is that the female students especially, the ones who are on the side of the land, there was something very emotive when they were like contending with some of the design ideas that were coming from the design side. They would say things like, for instance, oh, so you just want to do stuff on my body. So you just want to intervene on my body. I mean, when the guys on the other side started, they just sort of said, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And these guys were like, you started your presentation, but you didn't even greet us. So they didn't even greet the land, which I found to be incredibly profound. So we are yet to implement the actual project. The outcomes of this will come when they start doing the design in a couple of weeks. And so that's where we're at. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you to Gareth and the organizers for inviting me to be here. I feel that a disclaimer is necessary after hearing these two brilliant academics, that I'm not an academic. I have dabbled in teaching, so what I'm presenting to you today is from my experience with IFLA Africa and IFLA in general, and also as an employer, as a landscape architect who's looking to employ new graduates as they come out of schools. I think it's interesting and important, perhaps, to recap what Johan was saying yesterday about comparing, looking at the size of Africa and just what a ginormous continent it is, with 30.3 million square kilometers, which makes it 3 times the surface area of the United States, which I used as a reference since we are in the United States. It's also an extremely populous nation with 4.4 times the population of the US. These are figures from the end of 2023. And you'll see from the growth line that it's growing, the population is growing faster than the population of the US, but not as fast as the world population, which is maybe an encouraging sign. And then if we look at landscape architecture programs, there are 50, maybe somebody's probably going to correct me here, but if there are 50 universities in the United States that teach landscape architecture, whereas there's 17 in Africa. And of those 17, many don't teach landscape architecture per se. They don't have a program dedicated to landscape architecture. It might be environmental planning or urban design with a landscape bias. And each program obviously has a different focus, which is a good thing, as we've heard in the discussions before. So the countries with programs tend to be situated around the edge of the continent, with pretty big empty spaces in Central Africa and the Sahara and Sahel regions. The institutions which teach landscape architecture, there might be more than one in some countries, or the program that exists might have a graduate and an undergraduate university. 2 of the programs have had their curriculum approved by IFLA. in Casablanca and Kenya, and 2 are approved by the South African Council for the Landscape Architecture Profession, which has pretty high standards, and obviously those are in South Africa. So the École d'Architecture de Casablanca was approved, or the curriculum was approved by IFLA as part of their pilot program. And in fact, a really positive outcome of that was that the school changed its name. Instead of École d'Architecture de Casablanca, it became l'École d'Architecture et de Paysage de Casablanca, paysage meaning landscape. And then last year, in 2024, the Jomo Kenyatta University in Kenya, in Nairobi, had its program approved by IFLA. In the wings in Nigeria, for example, there are 2 new universities who have undergraduate degrees in landscape architecture approved by the government, but they don't have any students yet. So we're watching that closely to see how that develops. And I think it's important to notice that in South Africa, for example, where the landscape architecture profession is the organized landscape architecture profession is perhaps the oldest on the continent, that in fact the Institute of Landscape Architects was created before there were any education programs, which means that the first landscape architecture, formal landscape architects, came from other countries, from the US or from Europe. They were qualified there. So where are we going, and where should we be going? I mean, I don't know if we can be normative really, but just some thoughts. From my point of view, I think that recognition and education are really, really linked to each other. And in all countries in Africa, except South Africa and Kenya, which has auto recognition, what's a landscape architect? Huh? You do what? What's that? I mean, the profession really isn't recognized or known. And so how can you recognize a profession when there's nowhere to teach the tools for practicing that profession, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how do you teach something that doesn't exist? So it's it's the age-old chicken and egg situation which we're dealing with. And recognizing the profession is not for protectionism of the profession, but it's for maybe more noble goals, which all professional bodies should be taking care of. Protection of the public, protection of the environment, promotion of public health, sustainable development, and obviously there's an ethical component to that, which involves values and ethical conduct. And so I think that we need to move from the traditional classical way of getting licensure, as in a recognized degree in landscape architecture, a fixed number of years of experience, and then you get your licensure. We need to be moving to a much more flexible approach, which allows us to take into account the number of different pathways that is possible to becoming a landscape architect. And that is where IFLA is working really, really hard in terms of professional recognition through pathways involving education and or experience. So it's like a point system. So maybe you haven't actually got a university degree, but does that stop you being a landscape architect? And I think that's an important focus for the future. And I also think the points about education, that we're not really just talking about educating students. I think it's a profession that's really, really misunderstood, perhaps more so in Africa than in other places, but maybe not. So we should be looking at educating the public, educating decision makers, and educating other professions about what we do. And maybe the place to start with that is through interdisciplinary collaboration within our university. Start talking to each other from now. Does it matter where we teach? The debate about should we be in the art, architecture and planning faculty or in the agricultural faculty, which many landscape architecture programs are. And are we teaching architects or engineers? That might seem like a bit of a strange question in the US context, but in countries in Africa which were colonized by France, it's a really big issue because many of the landscape architects in France come from an engineering background. What do we teach? And I think there are 2 aspects to that. One, in the way in which we characterize the professional practice of landscape architects. And then I can refer you to IFLA's updated definition of the profession, which is actually quite long. Instead of 1 paragraph, it's quite a long definition because it's such a broad profession, and on the other side, looking at local context. And that's not only just physical context, as we've heard in all the presentations up until now. It's about geopolitical context, it's about cultural context, about social context, etc., etc., etc. And how do you define and then teach core competencies when landscape architecture is so diverse across the world, and in Africa also particularly diverse from country to country, even within countries, as we've heard today in many of the presentations. So are we fit to tackle local problems? Are we teaching our students to tackle local problems, such as, and we've heard a lot of them also today, cycles of flooding and drought, desertification and degraded landscapes? And I also think it's important to note that it's not just about the landscape, it's about the way those things change people's lives. They have a profound effect on the human experience as well as the landscape. Food security, and urban pressure on agricultural land, but also urban farming within cities, health and well-being of populations. And I think we can't talk about landscape architecture in Africa without mentioning displacement and migration, whether it be through people moved because of fire or floods, war, famine, or simply economic opportunity or perceived economic opportunity. Migration is a big issue. Exploitation of mineral resources, which you've already seen today, pollution by crude oil, for example, in the Niger Delta, preserving our heritage landscapes, and that's both tangible and intangible heritage. We need to have spaces where that intangible heritage can unroll and unfold. And then what I could maybe call urban acupuncture, responding very, very locally to creating and co-creating through participation of the population green spaces in dense urban settlements, and sometimes just in leftover spaces in informal settlements, for example. And Tana might recognize this image. And then we have a very nice problem, if you like, as in the case in Morocco, for example, where our cities are clean and green, but are they sustainable? And are they beautiful? There's a real problem around the use of green lawns, just everywhere in the city, which guzzle a lot of water, etc., etc., etc. Don't let me get onto that subject. And then this is just like a bundle of issues. They're not necessarily cause and effect, and one leading to another. But I think in a context when education opportunities are limited, obviously that gives us fewer landscape architects. And then engineers and architects don't really know that much about nature-based solutions. But why trust a landscape architect? Because who are the landscape architects anyway? Because the profession is not recognized, or it's almost absent. So bad practices get replicated. Landscape architects end up talking to themselves and not really making as much as an impact as they could. So what if I want to go through a couple of things that IFLA Africa has done to respond to this kind of problem. And the first thing was the drafting of an African Landscape Convention, which looks at a number of principles for landscape architecture and dealing with the landscape based on values cultural, sustainable values, indigenous communities, diversity, etc., etc. And then we drafted an education policy and standards document, which looked at pathways or looked at an accreditation procedure for different programs. And that has since been replaced by IFLA's Global Recognition Program, which I mentioned the two universities that had been accredited. The second project is the African Journal of Landscape Architecture, which is an online journal which was created to try and fill the gap in the absence of literature based particularly on African problems. And so we've had several issues that treat. This one happens to be illustrated, treating edible landscapes, healthy landscapes, iconic landscapes, indigenous knowledge landscapes, and the latest issue that's going to be coming out shortly on landscapes of hope. And so it's not a peer-reviewed journal, but we try and keep a really high standard. And Graham here is one of the editors of the journal, and I think so far it's been pretty successful. And then another initiative is the African Landscape Network, which is a platform for transdisciplinary collaboration. So it's essentially, it was created an initiative of IFLA Africa, but we worked on it in collaboration with ICOMOS to create an online map-based database as a platform for collaboration between different professions and between professionals within the landscape architecture profession. So we have a map, on the one hand, a map of individuals, which they don't have to be landscape architects. They could be archaeologists, geographers, historians, architects, anybody dealing with the landscape. And then on the other hand, a projects map, which gives details of what are seen as maybe best practice projects in Africa. And it's really easy to enter your information. So most of you here work with landscape in Africa. You should be on the map. And I think there's going to be a QR code that comes up at some stage, maybe when Graham's presenting. So please do scan it and enter yourself. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. The survey, it's a survey 1, 2, 3 of Esri. You fill out an online form, and you will be featured. And so this is the zoomed out look of the project's map. And then as you zoom in, you see the project outline. You see the searchability in terms of different categories, projects by focus, by size, by et cetera, et cetera. And here you see the relationship on the right-hand side between the form, a part of the form that you'll fill in, and then the outcome on the left-hand side, which gives you details, more details about the project. And then each project, you have to make sure that it works towards at least 2 of the key principles of the African Landscape Convention, and at least it works towards at least 1 of the SDGs. And that's our way of trying to make sure that the projects that are featured are in some way best practice. And they could also be preservation or management of landscapes. It's not only projects done by landscape architects. So going back to all those issues that I identified, I think the focus on education in Africa is really, really important, through things like accepting invitations to speak at conferences like this, to share and expose and make, expose the problems, to do a survey of existing programs, architecture programs maybe in Africa, and see where we could slot in easily a landscape architecture program. And then also to encourage all the existing landscape architecture programs in Africa to work towards the IFLA recognition of their curricula. And so with improving education, our numbers will increase, improved competency will lead to recognition of the profession, build awareness, improve collaboration, improving the visibility of the profession, building capacity, improving motivation, sharing, and of course, communicating successes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for 3 amazing and fascinating presentations. We hear, many terms: epistemic disobedience, pedagogical tools, council of non-human beings, professional registration, contested land. I'm just looking at my notes, and I think there's this fascinating range of topics. It's how to sort of draw threads through this. But, I think maybe the core of these presentations was in Carey's map of the African Landscape Network, where we see landscape architecture projects, and they roughly correspond to where landscape architecture schools are, which kind of makes sense, right? And then when you visit those projects, what is really fascinating is that you can see the link between pedagogy and built form, right? So how landscape architecture is taught then has an impact in the built environment. I mean, it's kind of logical, but it's less clear here where we've such a proliferation of landscape architecture schools that you go to see a project and maybe it's not so clear this person was trained at the GSD, or they went to Penn or Temple University or whatever. So I think for me, one of the key points to take away from this panel is the future of landscape architectural pedagogy. Carey, you mentioned, you think that in a way landscape architecture should perhaps move away from landscape architecture specific programs, and also I was surprised to hear you say that. Sechaba and Finzi are both teaching in schools of architecture, bringing landscape ideas to architecture students. In fact, just last month, or in January, I went to University of Johannesburg to the Graduate School of Architecture, where they had a really fascinating 3-day conference, where the first day there were 7 people invited from around the world to come, and we all presented. But the next 2 days was critiquing each of the units before the offering was made to students. So it's a form of peer review of the curriculum before the semester starts. And I thought that was a fascinating exercise. But what was more fascinating for me was that all of the units were dealing with landscape, right? So I know of at least 5 schools in Africa who are thinking of establishing a landscape architecture program. And in fact, Carey, there's one missing from your map. The Mbeya University of Science and Technology in Tanzania. They started a program, I think, 4 years ago with 25 students. The next year they had 25 students. The next year they had 50 students. So landscape architecture is growing quite quickly in Tanzania. Benson Karimuna is one of the lecturers there. And I have 3 students from Mbeya in my class every week on Zoom. Praise, Charity, and Calvin, and they're watching us today. But I wanted to ask, as landscape architecture education unfolds in Africa, should schools be thinking about establishing BLA programs, MLA programs, or bringing landscape architecture to architects, to engineers, and to others who shape the built environment? And I wonder if you could each address that question.
Go ladies first, seeing as I was last. I think, Gareth, to answer your question quickly, all 3 of the options you said. And I also I want to qualify something that I said. I don't think that landscape architecture should necessarily move away from. I'm not suggesting that we move away from pure landscape architecture programs, because I don't think that 1 year in landscape architecture after an architecture degree makes you a landscape architect. But that doesn't deny the fact that there are lots of people who have been working in landscape for many, many, many years and have acquired a whole baggage of landscape architecture, and so then we shouldn't deny them entry into the profession. So I do feel strongly that it takes at least 4 years, if you like, to be a landscape architect. I don't believe in the little year added on to a typical architecture degree, for example, that can make you a landscape architect. But I do believe that many years of experience in practicing could make you a landscape architect, and the whole idea is not to be exclusive, or to maybe like put our egos aside and say, other people have a really valuable, have lots of things to say that are really, really valuable. So.
Thank you.
I get a sense actually that the reason you saw all of those kinds of projects at the GSA is because people are really concerned about land. And land is a big topic in South Africa, like in many other places on the continent. And at my school, we've got a program, a master's in urban studies. And now, after you've just said what you've said, I'm wondering why we don't have a master's in land studies. because it seems like it's a really, it's just a topic that hasn't been really understood well enough. Because it's, I'm not a landscape architect, but the reason why I brought that into my curriculum is because of land. And as you know, like I said in my presentation, in South Africa, there's no way you can engage land as an architect or a landscape architect or an urban designer or a planner without that context, without the context of the historic injustices of land in our country. So to me, I think that's kind of what ties them together, and that's why you see the proliferation of that kind of topic in those programs.
Just to add to that, I went to a conference on hip-hop a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, is this the best use of my time? And yet, it was about South African hip-hop, and it was all about land. So it was fascinating, actually. So, Finzi. I think it goes up.
Testing? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Gareth. I'll answer it like this. By the year 2100, I think Africa will have the youngest population. Yeah. So the continent is growing. So I think for me, it's not necessarily, the question is not that should we start the Bachelor of Landscape or honors and masters. It's a question of designing programs that will address our issues. And Carey has outlined some of them, and you've seen in my presentations. Migration. Who's going to deal with migration the way we experience it in Africa? We can only do it effectively if we have programs that can respond to that. And if it is a landscape architecture program that looks at migration, like we did at a small level when we went to Kampala with my students, it was really understanding East African migration around the Lake Victoria and how they were transforming the landscape to answer their questions. And that is going to go on for the next 50 years. So if you don't have thinkers, practitioners, designers who can reimagine that program, I think we will be in trouble. So I really think that we need programs at every level. And with that, I'm saying the Bachelor of Landscape programs are going to be different from the rest of the world. It will speak about migration, flooding, for instance, because the first settlements were internal migrants and external migrants go and settle is on illegal land. That's the challenge. So I mean, for me, it's understanding the challenge and designing programs at various levels. And also a question of justice, social justice. I think we speak about Bachelor of Landscape Architecture and Masters, but who's going into those programs? Governments, if they want their communities or their societies to be really transformative, if they have a transformative agenda, must allow a fair amount of equality in terms of access to these programs. It is no point if you get a Bachelor of Architecture programs and you look at the demographics, it's all rich kids, for lack of a better term, going into those programs. Of course, they're going to come and copy Martha Schwartz and everyone else because they think that is landscape architecture. So for me, I think the challenge of African government is understanding Agenda 23 and how it transforms into relevant contextual landscape architecture programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Finzi, could you maybe talk to us a little bit more also about race and landscape architecture? I mean, I think UJ has been working quite a lot in that area in terms of architecture. And I remember one of the issues that came up in our focus group in Joburg was the fact that most landscape architects in South Africa are white. And could you maybe talk to us about that?
I think, can you hear me? Yeah. I think the issue of race, first of all, I think most of what I say I've built walking or standing on the shoulders of other giants. Graham here, I worked with at University of Pretoria, Turner there, and Johan van Papendorp in Cape Town. So I did work with them at some point, including Johan getting us lost on Table Mountain. But the issue is, right now you're talking about hip-hop. Hip-hop in Johannesburg is about identity, and it comes from the township. And when you listen, it's really people's emotions, or young people's emotions, or finding a channel to express themselves. And therefore, I showed you that video of the clip of the dancers, and that Tabo will know. That is the Nyao dancers, found in Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Yeah? The Chewa groupings that come. And those are young people there, young men, but actually they represent the spirits of the Chewa people. And what they do is fascinating, because it's they are regarded as spirits, but they are also involved in social justice. So in the Chewas, if you do something wrong, they won't take you to the court or to the chief. Those spirits will come. As you are watching in that public space, they'll come and embarrass you by whipping you with small twigs in public that you should respect your wife, and what you're doing is wrong. So it's an institution that exists to maintain order in society. Now, in designing that space, if somebody is from another race, they won't probably understand the intricacies of designing that public space so that it is used according to the principles that guide those guys. Because you can never, even if, I don't know whether I should say this, but I might have been dancing in that. Yes, but you will never know, because you never identify the Nyao dancer. That's the initiation process. So how does a colleague who is white understand how that happens? So I'm not saying they can't understand, they can understand. All I'm saying is that there are various ways of understanding society, and it must be inclusive. And the student who comes from the Chewa discusses with me those processes, and the student actually might not feel free to discuss with a white colleague than with me. Yeah. So I think it's recognizing that in that transaction of exchange between the student and the member of staff or the lecturer, there are relationships, and they are covert relationships. Covert in that they're established, where the students say, if I'm going to do this project, I'm not going to any other unit. I'm going to 15X. And then we say to the students, no, but 15X is full. Then I'll come next year. Finish. The student doesn't want to do the project in another unit because they say, no, in that unit they're going to give me a really tough time and they won't understand what I'm talking about. So for me, I think it's giving the students the opportunity to use their identity, their background and their convictions to express themselves in a landscape realm. So we provide that alternative. And I think that's a much more sustainable learning environment than one in which where there's only one race teaching.
Maybe we can open it up to the audience. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation.
Should be on.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I was just thinking about the presentations from the first panel and this panel, and I'm trying to make the connection. And I'm an architect, and okay, I'm just going to jump to the. I think for me the connection is that Audre Lorde, I'm going to paraphrase Audre Lorde, and probably badly, but she said you cannot build the master's house with the master's tool. You cannot rebuild the master's house with the master's tools. And I'm thinking that, you know, I was thinking about Professor Saidi's comments about, you know, you went through architecture and then you did a post-degree and you studied Frank Lloyd Wright and Versailles. And, you know, I think the issue is the difference between European derivative cultures and everyone else. And I think European derivative cultures is a celebration of the individual. And I think that is the issue with with European derivative architectural education. You know, Professor Maape was talking about the snake cave. You know, every architecture, every school of built environment, because I think just by calling schools architecture schools, you're already sort of putting a stratification there that should not exist. But every school of built environment should have a snake cave. And the students should go there and be there for a week to sort of let those egos, leave those egos at the beginning of the program. But they don't. They are taught about Frank Lloyd Wright and Versailles, and that is what they aspire to. And then I'm going to comment on Professor Duncan's remarks. You know, you talk about misplacement and migration. Well, we have displacement and migration in America. Look at LA. Look at the floods that are happening across the, you know, the eastern seaboard. You know, so it's not, these issues are not limited to Africa. They are here. So I don't think it's, so I was telling someone, why did they limit this to a landscape architecture conference? Because these are not architecture issues. These are issues about the built environment. And I think that, you know, the whole issue needs to be more holistic. And just one more comment. You know, when I was studying architecture, we had to take HVAC, we had to take structures, we had to take graphic design. Not a single landscape architecture course was required. You know, it's just, and so the people coming out of those programs, they design these buildings and they just go plop on the landscape. So, and they're not taught these subtleties. That was more a comment than a question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I feel that I'm going to follow on my colleague's prior question, and this is sort of a hybrid observation / almost question. I think after the last day and a half, I, for one, am feeling a tremendous urgency and great concern for the future of the cultural landscape of Africa. So, Carey, when you were presenting, just for fun, I Googled two things: landscape architecture in Africa and African landscape architecture. And in both cases, Harvard's GSD symposium came up first. I didn't use a news search, I used a generic search. For the former term, things like world landscape architecture come up first. And throughout your presentation, it was laced with we have to stop talking to ourselves. And it was preceded by two inspiring presentations that really showed how young people are engaging, and that is where the future is. I feel that there's sort of this dilemma right now where what's the communication strategy for the urgency to engage younger people that are based in Africa to, one, know that this exists as a career path? Because I think that as wonderful as the information is that's available for IFLA, it's in a very tiny dance on the head of a pin crowd. And so I would say deploying the student populations that are in your classes and opportunities like the Venice Biennale, how do we really think about this from a much more strategic communications perspective to cast a much longer shadow for the work that's being done?
I think it's a very pertinent observation that you made. And just look at the panel. We have two architects. Okay, Finzi's a landscape architect, but he's working in an architecture school.
We're claiming him.
Yes. And another architect. And I'm a landscape architect, but I'm not really doing all that much teaching. But I think it comes down to the fact that people don't know. Yeah, I mean, the profession of landscape architecture in Africa is really badly known. People don't know. They might know about architecture, they might know about urban planning, they might even know about maybe some environmental planning or reforestation or things like that. But landscape architecture itself is really not very well known. So yes, we do need a massive communication strategy. And what can I say except we're few in numbers. I mean, you saw the countries that had landscape architecture programs. They're the same as the countries that have landscape architects in them. And when I say landscape architects, I think in Morocco there might be, well, it depends on, they're between 15 and 100, depending on who you consider to be a landscape architect. In Kenya, I think there may be another 100. In Nigeria, somebody in Nigeria can tell me, but maybe like 32 or something like that. I mean, we really, South Africa might have 130, 125 or a few more. Okay. But so the numbers are few. And so, yes, we do need to show landscape architecture as a career path, but then where are they going to learn landscape architecture? They're going to come to Harvard, or they're going to come to the University of Pennsylvania, or because there's no space in other schools, because the other schools don't exist yet. So it's really kind of the chicken and the egg thing. But I take your point about communication, and I think we have a long way to do. Says she, looking at Monsieur the President of IFLA Africa.
Before we go to Jala, if I could just add to that. Because one of the things I heard when I visited the landscape architect, almost all the landscape architecture programs in Africa, is that they're not teaching about Africa either. I mean, this is another problem, right? And I think that we have a role to play there too, because one of the issues is people say there's no literature to teach with. But from our display in the library, and I hope some of you can go there during lunchtime, we can show that that's not strictly true. There is a lot of literature that we can work with. It's just not written by landscape architects. It's written by others about landscape in Africa. But here at GSD, we're doing an experiment with Professor Hildebrand's support, where I'm teaching a class on African landscape architecture. But to keep sort of a degree of symmetry and equality in the room, we have 16 students here. But then 16 students from various parts of Africa are joining us every week on Zoom. And it's on an informal way. They don't get credit, but they may get credit from their home institution. But it's just one way that we can help to generate discussions and knowledge. I was inspired by Aziza Abdul Fattah in Addis Ababa, who told me that they couldn't find anyone to teach theory in their landscape architecture course. So they had someone from JQuat teach the students in Addis on Zoom. So I think there's a lot that we can do through remote learning as well. But I'm conscious of time, and we have one more question.
Okay. Thank you. It's more a commentary and sort of a question to Sechaba and to Finzi. With your innovative teaching approaches, I was going to ask, what is the outcome that you anticipate, provided that we accept that it's not the product or the outcome, but it's the process of engaging. So I accept that, and it was amazing that there's performance and there's all sorts of role playing that is it's incredible. But do you have an idea? Can you anticipate what sort of outcomes? And also to Finzi. Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, if the students, I think you can see that in whatever way they're intervening, there is conscientiousness in relation to the landscape. The site that I gave them, actually, I didn't mention, is a very contested site in Johannesburg. It's the Wilds, which is one of the last left natural spaces, one of the last natural spaces in Johannesburg, in the city. And I gave them that site to see what they'll do with it, you know. And I wouldn't have minded if their value was we're not intervening at all, if they said that. So at the end of the day, it's really how have they made that kind of decision, you know, how have they dealt with that? In the example I showed you, it was too built up for me, and they, you know, they needed more snake cave.
For me, thank you, Jala. For me, the biggest outcome is the confidence. Because if the student leaves the university without any confidence, I think that no innovation will come out of there. So that's the first one, is really to give the student confidence. Number two, the outcome, yes, because we are guided by professional requirements that there must be a site plan section and elevation. Yeah, so we want to satisfy the statutory body that regulates us, whether it's a landscape or architecture one that, yes, the students understands the language. That's the minimum that we provide. But the other outcomes are other forms of representation, which might be a song that comes from the person's culture that has been passed on, but begins to tell the story of the future. So that the student can also then take it back to their community and use that to engage. But in also presenting it to us, they educate us that there are other ways. And that's why I put the dance there. That is a valid way of understanding the landscape and how it is used. So it might be a dance, it might be a musical performance. We should allow that as one artist, landscape artist, Catherine D. does say. Catherine D. explores various methods of representation. and argues that the standard plan section and elevation really doesn't capture the sense of the landscape. That's Catherine D. So that's the theory that we present to our students, to open their minds to say, but you might start the project with a performance. And so our students, I showed you Lerato, who was sitting on the floor, same as Princess yesterday. Lerato starts her presentation by sitting on the floor because she connects to the ancestors, she's bare feet, and begins that process of engaging with the project. So, but what we've done is we've given her the confidence to say, you go ahead and do this, and we will listen from what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I think it's a good moment to break for lunch. We're almost on time. And at 1 o'clock, there will be a soil painting workshop at the GSD. And we meet back here at 2:30. In the afternoon, our panel is more of a discussion on the future of landscape architecture. So if you have questions from this session, please bring them to the next. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.